My name is Chimbin Chui. I'm a professor here at University of Maryland and also directing the Build America Center, that is a USDOT funded program. So today we are honored to have Mike Garvin to really discuss the risk management in the project management field here. So before I introduce the speaker today, and I would spend probably 2 minutes to quickly go over the Build America Center in just for people who has not have no knowledge about us. We have been running the Build America Center over the past year, and significant initiative that has been done over the past year. So we want to really introduce ourselves and also solicited any kind of collaboration opportunity so that we can all work together and modernize the Americans' infrastructure here. So the Build America Center actually is a partnership between several universities, including Virginia Tech, Georgia Tech, Purdue, and Stanford. We also partner with many other national associations so that we can directly support those organizations and also government at all level to deliver infrastructure project there. And our mission is to become a knowledge hub of innovative financing and alternative project delivery through research, through outreach, and also technical assistant there. And especially over the past year, we are working diligently with the USDOT to really implement the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we spend tremendous efforts, time, and to help state, county, cities, and the disadvantaged community to applying for grant opportunity under the bipartisan infrastructure law. We have been very successful to support more than 10 public agencies and plus additional nonprofit and even university to applying for grants. And based on the result, we have already helped those government agencies to secure more than $13 million to deliver their infrastructure project and cover many Safety Street for All program, SMART program, reconnecting community, thriving community, those kind of program. And we're working with several other state and local government to applying for other programs, charging infrastructure programs there, and regional infrastructure accelerator program there. So, and just to let everyone know that we have this Build Launchpad platform, which is actually a product that can help local public agency to understand the funding opportunity and also plan ahead based on the previous funding application window, and also learn from the past the successful project applications there. And we collect many, I would say right now, more than 100 application package, which includes the narrative, benefit cost analysis, and all the supporting documents, even the letter of support, so that you can see who write the letter to support those grant applications there. And currently we have about 900, more than 900, close to 1,000 users already since we released this Build Launchpad platform in January. And of course, we are available to really work directly to help the local public agency to apply for grants and also deliver their infrastructure project there. We're right now looking for partnerships to really applying for that charging and fueling infrastructure program. So we're trying to really implement some of the innovative idea that we developed through the research, and we want to really make that happen there. So some of the example that we are working on, just to give you example here, that we're working with the state of Louisiana. We are working with small county, a small city in Oregon to help them to apply for the grants and incorporate. We also incorporate the innovative idea and to work with that. So, end of the day, that all this is success based on the partnership. So it's one of the initiatives that Professor Michael Garvin is chairing, and that's our webinar series. We call it a Modernized Infrastructure, Modernized American Infrastructure webinar series here. And so I want to quickly introduce our speaker here. And Mike is a professor at Virginia Tech, and he's our regional center, basically covering the Northeast and pretty much East Coast also. And Mike has been national and international leaders in public-private partnership, alternate project delivery, risk management, and Mike has recognized by many prestigious award, including that the Presidential Early Career Award for scientists and engineers. And Mike also served on some of the many of those board of directors, including the AIAI and ADBAS P3 committees there. So Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, QC. Let me try to get the slide deck up here. Okay, hopefully everybody can see the slide deck.
Yep, you're good.
All right, great. So I'll dispense with sort of introducing myself, but I do want to talk about, so the subject for the webinar today, we'll be looking at, risk management and transportation projects, and what are the challenges and I think the opportunities, and the focus will really be on, looking at major transportation projects. QC already mentioned, this modernizing infrastructure webinar series that we are organizing through the Build America Center. This is the first of these webinars that we'll be doing periodically, roughly every month, between now and December. Most of these sessions will be, at this scheduled on Friday from 12 to 1. The next session, which I'll give a plug for at the end of the webinar, is actually going to May 25th, so that's a Thursday. But just be on the lookout for announcements that come from back, the Build America Center each month. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We've got a fair number of participants here, so please stay muted, during the presentation. I would invite you to type questions into the chat, and I think Carly can kind of keep track of those, and so can I. And then actually there's be an opportunity to do Q&A at the conclusion, but also I think an opportunity to look, at probably midpoint in the presentation or in the webinar to take some questions if there are any that are out there. So with that, we'll get things rolling here. And so if we look at major transportation projects, over the last couple decades, I don't think it'd be a surprise to anybody that's here as part of this webinar. Many have been implemented using alternative project delivery methods. Why is this happening? There's this potential to align project goals and characteristics, and a number of expected benefits, through using alternative delivery methods, from improved cost and schedule performance, accelerating project delivery, better lifecycle performance, and then risk transfer to the private sector. Now, so I want to take a deeper look at, this sort of risk transfer tenet, which, is expected to produce benefits and then provide incentives to the private sector and reduce exposure to the public sector. So in theory, you've got this sort of arrangement here where, there's a sweet spot you can sort of think of where a project has acceptable financial return and cost to both of the parties as the risk tends to increase. But as risk gets as risk increased too much, or let's say too much risk is being transferred, it starts to become untenable for both parties. And so that's that's not a good outcome, and because there are a number of issues that can arise from inappropriate risk allocation, which have been documented in a variety of research. Inefficiency of the management of the overall project, high transaction costs, frequent disputes among the counterparties, and ultimately can obviously impact market participation. So I think what the challenge has become, and this has been recognized for a while, is this really about risk transfer, or should it be more about optimal risk allocation? And I think one of the things that is becoming clearer, over the last several years is that one of the problems with inappropriate risk allocation, or let's say too much risk transfers, that can have significant impacts in the market itself. And so this is a quote from an article that was published in ENR, where James Roberts, the CEO at Grant at the time, talked about the problems with this kind of model that's resulted in an untenable imbalance in risk sharing. Shortly thereafter, there was another article that was published by ENR where Robert Alger, who was the CEO of Lane Construction at the time, part of the Purple Line Construction Partners, basically told that the current P3 model based on lump sum turnkey projects is broken, and so forth. And so the consequence of this is we've seen key players have either exited the market, or are becoming far more selective with respect to the markets they would participate in, or the project that they would pursue. And so I think what's motivated some of the work that we're doing at the Build America Center, and some other work that I'm involved in, is we really want to be in a position, we really want to look at how do we rewrite this headline that's appearing in publications like ENR. And so there are a couple of different initiatives that are underway to really address this problem. The first is under the Build America Center, and it's a project that we've undertaken here at Virginia Tech, where we just completed the first phase of that work, where essentially we took a look at risk allocation and sharing and transportation P3s, developing a state of practice report, and we're expecting to continue on to phase 2 here shortly to develop some guidelines, and I'll talk a little bit more about phase 2 here shortly. I'm also involved in an NCHRP research project where we're doing a very similar investigation, or it's motivated for the same reasons, but it's quite a bit broader in scope, because it's looking at alternative project delivery, ranging from CMGC to progressive design build to P3s and so forth. So the scope of the work there is quite a bit broader, and it's got a little bit more aggressive, or aggressive may not be the right word, but a different output or deliverable that will come out of that work. So what I'm going to be focused on in this webinar is what we found in the development of this state of practice report that was done under the Build America Center. So first, how are risks being typically allocated? What risks are particularly problematic, and how can risk allocation management be improved? And this study was focused on P3s, and so I just make sure that folks understand that that was the scope of the investigation. So there were really sort of two strategies to develop this report. The first was we did an update of an assessment of risk allocation in P3 contracts that essentially looked at what's risks were transferred, retained, or shared, focusing on more recent transactions, because there was a prior study that we did here at Virginia Tech that looked at projects through about 2016, to see if, has anything changed in these recent transactions. The second sort of stage of the work was to do a series of interviews with practitioners so that they give the opportunity to share their perspectives about what's going on in the market, and provide their input on how, what are the challenges, and what are the ways that we can potentially improve risk management in the marketplace. And I guess I just want to emphasize that this interview process was designed to provide a representative view of risk allocation practices, not necessarily a completely exhaustive view, but that was the approach taken. So what I'm going to do is talk first about the update of the risk allocation assessment that we did. So these there were 26 projects, contracts that we took a look at. These are all major highway, bridge, and tunnel or transit P3s that have been implemented in the U.S. Between 2006 and 2019. We excluded any asset leases. We were looking at projects where essentially it's a DBFOM type of arrangement. Cumulative contract value of these projects was just at about $40 billion. We were looking at 30 different risks in this assessment, and so I've just listed a few here, that are in sort of general construction and operations category. So in the general domain, change in law, construction, utilities and site geology and site conditions. And then on the operations side, things like demand, network and latent defects. And so those are the types of the risks that we looked at. So the table that's shown over here is the 30 risks are in the first column, and then essentially the other columns are whether our assessment was the risk being retained by the public sector, was it being transferred to the private sector, or was there a sharing arrangement that was being utilized? And so what the table is illustrating is the predominant allocation for each one of the risks. And so you'll note that there was no single risk that was actually predominantly retained by the public sector. There were quite a few that have been transferred to the private sector. And then there are also quite a number that are being shared by the public and the private sector. But what we found is essentially that the more recent contracts have not made any substantial change or any variance between what we had seen from the prior investigation. And so the risk allocation I would say the risk allocation paradigm that's been in place for roughly a decade now has been consistent over the last several years. I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the variety of risk sharing methods that we saw in these contracts. In total, we identified 15 unique methods that are being employed. One of the most common is what are known as deductible schemes, where the developer or the concessionaire is taking a portion of the risk up to a threshold, and then beyond that, either the public sector and the developer and concessionaire are sharing it, or perhaps the public sector is assuming it. So, as an example, this is a deductible scheme for compensable cost events that would occur during construction that we found in Central 70 in Colorado, where compensable costs for any event during construction in aggregate is, as long as it was less than $20,000, then the developer was responsible for those costs. If it goes beyond that, then basically the enterprises, in this case, this is the Colorado Bridge enterprise, and what at the time was known as the High Performance Transportation Enterprise at CDOT, would cover those costs. Another a sharing mechanism that we've seen is what we call proportion or proration schemes. And so this is an example from the I-75 modernization project in Michigan, where this sort of proportional type of scheme was being employed with respect to interest rate risk, pre-financial close. And so it's basically talking about the credit spread, risk or benefit between MDOT and the developer will be implemented on an 85-15 basis, where MDOT would basically take 85% of the fluctuation on that credit spread, and the developer would assume 15%. So this is what we characterize as a proportion or proration type of scheme for sharing of risk, in this case, interest rate movements. I think folks that are familiar with this market are probably very much aware of event mechanisms that are being employed within these kind of arrangements. And so we characterize these as a risk sharing method. So with any given contract, they may be referred to as a relief event, a compensation event, a delay event, a supervening event, but by and large, they're similar in nature. Their application to a variety of risks, from things like socio-political opposition to latent defects to force majeure and so forth. But these are procedural in nature. And I guess the reason why we've characterized them as a sharing method is that at the time of contract formation, neither of the parties knows whether the related risk will surface and which party will bear it. But once the risk materializes, the counterparties are going to basically go through the process to find and the relevant event mechanism provisions to determine whether or not additional compensation in our time is going to be granted. So again, these event mechanisms are a rather common feature of these kinds of arrangements. So at this point, I'm going to maybe stop, and looks like there's a few questions that have popped up in the chat of these projects. How many were completed on time with the budget? I guess the question's related to these projects back here. It's a good question. I don't have that information at hand, and but it's something that could certainly follow up on if needed. Okay, so I'll move forward. So again, I think the first sort of looking at the first look at have risk allocation with these contracts. Has anything changed with the recent transactions? And the answer to that question was essentially no. So that leads us to the practitioner interviews that we conducted. So we talked to practitioners that represented developers, contractors, public agency representatives, as well as consultants. And it's probably worth noting that a fair number of the practitioners that we spoke to had experience, in both the public and the private sectors. So we were getting, felt like the interviews we did, we got a good, like I said, representative sort of sample of practitioners that are in the marketplace. I will say that we probably didn't have the opportunity to interview as many folks from the public sector as we would have preferred, but we still got quite a good bit of input from I think folks with public sector experience. So as a consequence of the interviews, there were a number of general issues that were identified. Not surprisingly, the sort of fixed price date certain structure that we see, being implemented in P3s was mentioned by a number of different interviewees, and they see that this commercial structure as being at the root cause of a lot of the problems in the marketplace, because from their perspective, you're getting a situation where you're having risks that are being transferred that are potentially not under the doesn't provide the opportunity to manage or control them, which results in one of two things: either contingency pricing, which is essentially going to make a proposal uncompetitive, or perhaps the risk itself that's being transferred is too substantial, so the exposure is too great, and the potential participant decides to actually drop out of the procurement. A fair number of comments about project preparation and competitive procurements. The level of due diligence that's being done by the public agency prior to initiating a procurement. Some of the signals of issues that folks talked about, including inadequate feasibility studies like traffic and revenue had been done, incomplete geotechnical investigations, limited design development, potentially not enough outreach to key stakeholders, and so forth. And so one of the comments that one of you said, is that one of the main challenges is submitting a competitive price based on incomplete plans and information. And so, again, this is an issue that needs to be taken a further look at. Somewhat comparable or related was reliance on information provided in procurements. And so, I think this is an interesting pragmatic issue for both, I think, the public sector and the private sector at the same time. On the public sector side, there are clearly constraints on the amount of time that a public agency wants to devote, as well as money to investigating existing conditions, or the amount of information they have on existing structures and so forth. And so there's only so much information they can potentially provide, in the documents, and then they have to then make a decision based upon the quality of that information. Do they want that information to be relied upon, or is it essentially being provided for the general purpose and use of the developers or the DBJV? On the flip side, I think developers and DBJVs face a similar issue in that they've only got so much time that they can devote to investigating the existing conditions on site, the existing conditions on structures. Once certainly during procurement and even after award is made. And so I think this is a dilemma that that we've got to sort of take a closer look at, is what kind of information can be provided, and then what level of reliance should be granted. Relief events came up as from both the public and the private sector sides, and so again, because these type of event mechanisms are very common, and these sort of arrangements, there's I think an equal amount of frustration I heard from both the public and the private sector about relief events. From the public sector side, I think one of the things that that frustrates the public agency is that they'll get a notice from from a developer, and oftentimes from their perspective at least, there isn't sufficient information at that point in time to make a determination of whether or not relief should be granted. On the flip side, I think what I heard from the private sector is that the reason, essentially the reason why there may or may not be when notice is issued to a public agency, the reason why the evidence base may not be sufficient to determine whether or not entitlement has been established is that because oftentimes the issues that are being encountered are relatively complex, and it's going to take a certain amount of time to figure out or determine the extent and the nature of the issue. So I think, again, relief events is an area that needs to be taken a further look at. Some discussion about the developer and the DBJV relationship. So in these projects, I think we've got sort of three-tier structure here. You've got the public agency owner at the top. You've got the the developer or the concessionaire sort of in the agent role to the owner, but then you got the DBJV working obviously for the developer or the concessionaire. And so I think there was I think from the public sector side, there was some frustration expressed over on occasions, the developer potentially not enforcing requirements of the contract or the agreement. And so that the DBJV, or I should say the developer, being a little bit more passive enforcement of provisions of a contract than the public sector would prefer. And then between the DBJV and, let's say, the developer, you've got a different, you've got a different relationship between, the DBJV is in a little bit different position than the developer. And so, one of the I think the frustrations I heard coming from folks that are in sort of the contractor community, has to do a lot with liquidated damages. So, the liquidated damages that might be imposed on the DBJV from the developer are potentially higher than that the owner is imposing from onto the developer. And so that mismatch creates some issues and some tension in that relationship. Project context, so this came up a couple of different times. I think this is, this quote that came from one of the interviewees, I think really summarizes this issue well. It's in that we tend to rely a lot on, precedents have been established from one project to another. But, this quote, I think, makes it clear that, because of projects are not necessarily cookie cutters or prototypes of one another, just because you accepted a risk in project X doesn't mean that you can accept it in project Y, because the likelihood of its occurrence could have changed, impact could have changed, or potentially both. And then finally, I think what was came through loud and clear in these interviews was the need for just better communication amongst all the parties. And this is a nice quote from one of the folks that I interviewed. It's just, you may or may not have the same sort of perspective as your counterparty. So it's important that you listen to what they have to say, particularly when it comes to risks. So then we turned, so after having in these interviews, we picked up on some of these general issues. Then we started talking more specifically about, risks themselves. And so what I've displayed, the risks that were identified as potentially being most problematic, and in some ways these are the usual suspects, so may or may not be surprising to anyone in the webinar, but the things that sort of came up in the general category were, inflation. Most folks mention this, and I think this is, a consequence of what we've experienced in the United States over the last few years, where, inflation has now become something, we have to take account of, where, for the decade prior, it's not something we had to worry too much about here in the United States. Somewhat interesting change in law was mentioned. I think the structure that we're seeing in place is fairly common, where you've got discriminatory versus non-discriminatory changes. And I think that's pretty common across most of the projects and contracts. But I guess one of what was mentioned is that, what would be discriminatory versus non-discriminatory is not always as clear cut as it might seem to be. So there have been some issues and some projects over whether or not a change that's been made is discriminatory or not. So shifting away from more general and then getting into more construction-oriented risks. Every single entity or every single interviewee we talked to talked about the issues with third parties, whether those third parties are utilities, other jurisdictions or agencies that are involved in some manner in the project. And so, third parties, I think, there's definitely an issue with the coordination needed with third parties, who's responsible for that coordination. And then if you have a lack of performance by a third party, such as a utility, then how is that handled within the project? And so I think there are a number of areas where we need to take a harder look at the way that we're dealing with and handling third party issues in these kinds of arrangements. Site and geological conditions. Not surprisingly, most mention those. Again, this is kind of harkening back to that more general issue of reliance. Again, what information is being provided, and to what extent, can that information be employed productively? I think is still an issue in a number of these projects. A subset, I think, of sort of site conditions is hazardous materials. I think what was the issue that is being expressed here is in some cases who gets assigned or the determination of, so you encounter hazardous materials or there's hazardous materials on the site. There's I guess a question at times about who was the generator of the material. Was it something that was it already existing, or was it something that the developer, the DBJV, was responsible for? And so that was the issue that was being, I think, addressed for the most part in the comments received there. Right of way, interestingly, again, seems to be an area where there's not a consensus on the way that right of way should be managed. I think that the issue here is really the acquisition of right of way is obviously extremely important to the planning and sequencing of construction activities. And so if there are any issues with the acquisition of right of way, that's going to obviously have an impact on what the developer and the DBJV have laid out for the construction process. And so this again becomes another, you could think of it as another subset of a third party issue, is the coordination with the the entities that need to be coordinated with to acquire right of way. And if there's any delay or any issues with that process, what relief is granted and how. Revenue risk, actually came up a couple of times, and so I think one of the interesting comments that was received about with respect to revenue risk was, I think there's the point that was being made is, what's the most viable, or what's a reasonable level of or toll pricing that can be put into place that's affordable and feasible, and what's the amount of scope that you can deliver for that level of pricing or that toll regime. And so that's an area where I think some projects have potentially maybe had an imbalance between the revenue potential and the scope of the project that was being attempted to be implemented. Operation and maintenance, again, just mentioned. I think here the point that was being made most frequently, and the folks that brought it up, was that in many respects public agencies remain. This is an area where they remain have a lack of experience, and so it can become an issue at times with oversight and those sorts of things. Latent defects came up, in projects where there are existing structures, and so the point made by the interviewees here was, oftentimes when we're looking at things like latent defects, it's extremely difficult to know ex ante what the potential exposure might be, right? So if a latent defects materializes, how much exposure is a developer or a DBJV potentially dealing with, and so it can move into that sort of realm of it starts to look a lot like an uncapped liability. Then finally, handback, was mentioned by several interviewees. I think largely because in the United States, at least, we don't have a lot of experience with handback, but a couple of, I think, interesting points were made by folks in this area. One, while the process has been defined, fairly consistently in most of the contracts, what may become an issue is that the way the condition at handback has been specified in a number of different contracts as a remaining service life approach, right? And so I think some of the interviews anticipate some debate, and maybe some maybe debate may not be the right word, but some disagreement over what the remaining service life is between the public and the private sector. Another, I think, interesting point that was raised was that one of the interviewees said that it's probably, the handback process is important, but if you've been enforcing your key performance indicators that are related to your assets over time, that's probably going to be a better strategy to make sure that you're getting the assets back and the sort of condition and the level of service that you want, than relying on the handback process. So again, that's a snapshot of the most problematic risks, and a few of sort of the insights that came out of the interview process. So the recommendations, so after we talked about, some general issues, what are problematic risk, we then diverted our discussion to, what can we do to improve risk allocation in the market overall? And every interviewee basically, said that we need better communication and dialogue about risks. I mean, that's not necessarily surprising, but this is a quote from one of the interviewees. Again, looking at this as pursuit of optimal risk allocation versus a risk transfer, and so that's what the goal this dialogue and communication should be. There was a lot of, I would say, support for one-on-one communication about risk in these, in these kind of projects, both pre-procurement and during procurement, and getting to a point where you maybe you're having this kind of discussion about each and every risk and what are the best provisions to handle and shape those risks. Another was, enhanced or improved project preparation. So that was identified as a general issue. One of the quotes that interviewee said is, again, what's the minimum essential scope for a P3? What can owner do to set a project up for success through its due diligence? And so, those are two questions owners need to consider carefully, because those are going to relate to, obviously, how much project are you trying to deliver, relative to the revenue potential, if it's a toll concession, or if it's an AP type arrangement, how much of a AP payment are you willing to make for the scope that you're thinking about? Another point that was made, again, not surprisingly, because I think it goes back to the sort of universal perspective that third parties are problematic in these kind of projects, is that one interviewee said, look, we need these types of agreements need to be put in place in advance of procurement and not negotiated during the procurement process, because this can reduce uncertainty around what third party obligations are, or at least the parties know where issues remain. And so, again, that's a perspective that one of the interviewees provided. Another thing that that several interviewees brought up was considering progressive or collaborative development. So I think this is utilization, or the potential utilization of progressive models has certainly gotten a lot of traction or a lot of discussion of late, and so it wasn't surprising that we saw the same sort of suggestions from the interviewees through this process. This is a quote from one of the interviewees. Again, looking at should a public agency evaluate whether it's appropriate to have a competitive versus a negotiated process. So is there more value through dialogue and collaboration in advancing a project versus going through a competitive procurement process? Now, I'll say this perspective was not necessarily universal. Some folks had a little bit more skeptical view of the potential for progressive models, and so this is a quote from another interviewee, is like, hey, this is maybe a remedy, and perhaps it might make sense under certain conditions, but the question that is this solving the root causes of a project's principal risk? Does a more reasonable communication and diligence and a conventional procurement resolve these issues, right? So that gets back to if a public agency is doing its due diligence, going through project preparation activities that are sufficient, is that going to resolve the issue, or is it truly a project that's got a level of complexity where a progressive model makes sense? And so, again, a question that still needs, I think, resolution. Not surprisingly, there were some recommendations. We need to improve dispute resolution, finding those mechanisms that are going to do this faster and more equitably, so those problems are not lingering, resulting in major claims. So that was a perspective of one interviewee, and then another interviewee suggested that there might be ways to do this, such as create an option where the owner would continue to fund constructions as disputes are being addressed or resolved, so they can enter into an interim binding agreement for a claim or dispute where the owner continues to fund the work while reserving the right to recoup funds later if justified. Again, so that was just a recommendation from one of the interviewees about how you might, I think, improve dispute resolution and expedite the process. So either a decision's not lingering about whether entitlement's been established, or a contractor's not doing work at risk, and cash flowing the project. So I'll go ahead and summarize, and I see some comments in the chat and I'll come back to these. So I think to summarize, what came out of the work that we completed, there is a need to rewrite the headlines about mega projects and alternative project delivery, because if that's not done, I think we're going to potentially lose or have this tool that we need in our toolbox, get reduced. As I've already mentioned, the risk allocation in recent transactions has remained consistent over the last decade. So there was really no change between transactions that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years and ones that we had looked at as early as 2006. And again, there are a range of issues, risks, and recommendations that we need to further consider for planning, and I think implementation of P3s. So next steps overall. So this state of practice report that I've kind of run through here and summarized, it will be published next month. So that will be coming out from the Build America Center. I think future work that we're hoping to do in phase 2 will be looking at, building out some guidelines for risk allocation and management, where tools or practices like the ones that I've sort of listed here are recommended. So, at a macro level, and a public agency has got, manuals or guidelines by delivery method. Those are published, and there are a number of those examples that are already out there, in the market. There are several DOTs that have these kind of guidelines or manuals in place. More frequent and I think improved use of risk registers, get them developed and then adapt and modify them as projects evolve. Utilization of standard term sheets for typical projects by delivery method, doesn't mean that can't change, from one project to another, but at least establishes a baseline of understanding with respect to, different risks and different sort of conditions on a project, or, for a particular delivery method. So, increases the transparency in the market. And improving or providing more opportunities for engagement, procurement through industry forums, during procurement and one-on-one meetings, potentially conducting iterative or issue and review of RFP documents. And then once we get into, implementation, considering, relational practice such as partnering and so forth. So I'll stop there, and let me go over here to the chat and take a look at what are the questions that are out there. Do you have any data on the sample projects? How many were procured on a firm fixed price basis versus progressive? Interested in how the risk allocation may differ for parties or co-creating commercial structure. That's a good question. So the vast majority, I'll just jump back to those that set of project. The vast majority of these projects were, if they're procured competitively. But there are some projects in here that were, the consequence of unsolicited proposals, or a situation where, they were developed as a consequence of an interim agreement. So, for example, the Elizabeth River Tunnels project in Virginia, started out as a competitive procurement, but when VDOT, they only received one one response for conceptual proposals. They then entered into an interim agreement, and in many respects that became, a type of progressive or collaborative approach to developing that project. I guess the question is, have we looked at, the difference in allocation between risks and those types of arrangements, and risk in more competitive procurements, and we haven't explicitly looked at that, but it's something we could certainly do moving forward. But in some respects, I don't know that, based upon what we've seen, there were substantial differences, at least in who was carrying what risk. Where I think there might be differences would be in, the way the risk was potentially, the way the risk was potentially structured, or if the risk was shared, there might have been a difference in the way the risk sharing was structured. So, that's a good question for us to potentially take a look at moving forward. Of the general issues, what might be the easiest to address, or the one that's most critical? That's a good question. I don't know that any of these are all that easy to address. And I think that's the goal of the efforts we're doing here, in the Build American Center, and then, as I mentioned, this complementary NCHRP project. I think in the competitive marketplace, I'm not sure I'm going to see a shift. Owners have, would they have a willingness to shift away from this fixed price state certain structure? Perhaps. That's certainly a driving factor. I think when you're looking at, the way commercial structures are put in place for CMGC or progressive design build, you're essentially getting away from, that kind of structure. And again, I think that's why you see at least a lot of interest in the P3 space for, using progressive approaches as well. The one that's I think is one that could, the reliance issue is one that I think that could potentially be addressed, maybe a little bit more readily than some of the others. There's actually been some recent research done through NCHRP reports, that has looked at specifically geotechnical risk, and has made some recommendations for how geotechnical risk could be handled more efficiently, and so that's something we'll be taking a look at. So I think the short answer to the question is, I'm not sure any of these general issues are easily addressed, and I'm not sure there's any one that's any more important than the other. I guess if there's something that's more critical, I think, because in the interview process, what we heard, communication, and open and transparent dialogue between the parties, I think is probably, I would say, it sounds like, the one that's most critical, and probably the one that could make the biggest difference, particularly if the parties, if they're talking openly and honestly about a risk, and let's say we're considering, adopting a deductible scheme for a potential risk, that need to have a good understanding of, okay, at what threshold should that deductible scheme, how much risk, or how much of the risk should the developer or the DBJV carry, how much, at what point should it be, how long should it be potentially shared between the two parties, and at what point should maybe the public sector take that. I think that's, if those kind of discussions are had and these thresholds aren't just established arbitrarily, arbitrarily may not be the right word, or are not being established by precedent, you know, that a project of comparable nature, we set the thresholds at this level. That's maybe a way to deal with that. And then, in addition to identifying risks, that any of the interviews identify opportunities or project successes worth repeating. Yeah, I think the recommendations were, you know, these recommendations that I ran through were a consequence of their experiences on projects, and you know, I think they would all, you know, if I went back and asked them about, you know, examples of, you know, projects that where project preparation was done sufficiently, we could certainly identify those. Did any of the projects surveyed implement formal project risk management during the course of the projects, either quantitative or qualitative? Short answer to that question is yes. You know, I'd have to go back and, you know, identify which of those projects did. So at this point, I know we're at time, so I'm going to kind of jump ahead here. Yeah, this is a plug for the next webinar. It's going to be, as like I said, on May 25th. Our presenter will be, you know, Dr. Kingmin Chi from the University of Maryland, who opened up the session here, and he's going to be talking about equity analysis, you know, at the project level. So I appreciate you attending. You know, I'm certainly willing to stay on for a few more minutes if folks have questions, and try to answer those questions, you know, before we wrap everything up. But you know, if you need to leave, obviously you're free to go.
Thank you, Mike.